Hello, and welcome to another episode of Brettcast Let's Read. You thought this series was dead, but you were mostly right. Honestly, I had zero intentions of making any more Let's Read videos, but then I saw a video and had to make one because this is too good to not make a video on. I've been watching a lot of videos by Drew Gooden and Danny Gonzalez. And one of the videos they did together, I believe is on Drew's channel, was the one where they read a fan fiction about themselves. And that's why I am making another Let's Read video. So on this episode, I'm going to be reading a YouTuber fan fiction titled House of Gold by Drew Danis Love with 2 V's. According to Wattpad, this story is still ongoing, so they may add to the story after I release this video. This is in 9 parts, and if you forgot the format of these videos, what I do is read a part and then talk about the part I just read, then go on to the next part. I read things as they are written, so if there are spelling errors, I'm not fixing them. I will just say them. With the introduction out of the way, let us read on. We start off things with Part 1. Danny looked at the apartment where his best friend and crush of 3 years waited. He saw him in the window and waved at him, and his heart started beating too fast. He opened the door. "Hey, silly, get in," he said, and Hen gulped and pulled his luggage into the house. Drew hugged him. "I've been so lonely since Amanda went missing in Afghanistan." "That's so brace of her. She loved you." Drew stared at him for a minute. "Yeah, ... Let's get you settled in." And then he helped him to his room. "It's a 1-bedroom place, so you'll have to share a room with me," he smiled at him. "It'll be like a sleepover. Totally." Then there was a knock at the door, and Danny followed Drew to the door where they found a girl with long brown hair and big purple eyes waving. "Hi," said Drew. "Hi," she said, flipping her black hair, revealing her badass studded belt around her black jeans and black top that had sleeves to her arm and skull earrings and black makeup. "I'm your neighbor Jackie," she said happily. They both shook her hands. "If you need anything, come on over," she said, and then left. "She was pretty nice," said Danny. "And pretty cute," said Drew. And Danny felt a pain in his heart. Was Drew totally straight? He always wondered if he was bi because of how he flirted with him sometimes on Skype. He didn't know if her would tell him he is gay and is in love with him. Then Drew gave him a sweet smile and he felt warm again. And that is the end of Part 1. There's a lot to take in here. There is an apparent lack of not only spelling, but punctuation and random times that names are and are not capitalized. One thing I find really funny is how, Drew is just coming to live with Danny, and yet the neighbor Jackie just came over to introduce herself. Both Drew and Danny just only moved into this apartment. Also, why is it that Drew and Danny only flirted on Skype and nowhere else? I also like how Drew just calling one girl cute causes Danny to instantly think that Drew is 100% straight because he called one girl cute. It's funny because, Danny wonders if Drew is bi, so if Drew is bi, then he would also be into girls too. Anyway, let's continue. The next part of the story is titled Heavy. Drew made a drink for him and Danny and sat at the couch and drank beer. They turned on a movie and watched some funny TV shows and drank all nights until it was 7 a.m. the next morning. Drew pointed at the rising sun. "Hey, Dan, look," he laughed, drunk. Dan stumbled over but tripped and fell right into Drew's arms. Suddenly they were starting in each other's eyes. Their faces started itching closer and closer when suddenly there was a knock at the door. Drew blushed and let go of the embrace and went to the door. "Hello?" he asked as he opened the door. Then there were two guys in black ski masks, and they grabbed Drew and threw him down the apartment stairs and ran off. They kidnapped him! 4 exclamation points. Danny tried to run after their white van, but couldn't run as fast as a car. He called the cops and cried in the apartment. Then, suddenly he got a message on YouTube that said, "If you want to see him alive again, make a video about 10 reasons why the Paul brothers are awesome and you're wrong." He gasped. 4 dots. And yeah, that's where Heavy ends. Yes, the spelling and grammar mistakes are still going on, and I don't think that will change. Honestly, thought the spelling mistakes made some really damn funny moments, though. The whole their faces started itching closer is just absolutely hilarious to read because it sets an entirely different image in my head of what's happening in the story. I also love in the beginning of this where they turn on a movie, but then they just ignore the movie and put on funny TV shows and watch those instead, because that makes sense. Let's continue. The next part of the story is titled On the Third Cold Night. There was a knock at the door. Danny went over to it and gasped, "Logan Paul!" Meanwhile, somewhere in Costa Rica, Drew had a bag on his head and he was punched hard. "Let me go! I never got to tell Danny I love him." Well, in that case, ... Then he was shoved into a van and they started driving. Danny made tea for Logan and himself, and Logan looked at him sweetly. "I'm so sorry. The Team 10 will help you find him. I almost kissed him before he..." "It's okay." He touched his hand. They looked sweet at each other. "I'm always here for you." Logan leaned in and kissed Danny tightly on the lips, and in a moment of desire and desperate, he pulled Logan close and kissed him harder. They started making out, and Logan got it on Danny and started rubbing on him. They made out and wiggled around the couch until Danny broke away. "I can't." "Drew." "Oh, but he was a loser?" "Go, Logan, go away." And he grunted and left mad. Danny went into his room to cry. And that is the end of On the Third Cold Night. One big question I have is, what does the title of this part of the story have to do with anything that actually happened in the story? Is it the third day that Drew has been missing and it's in a cold month of the year? That wouldn't make sense because I'm pretty sure all these people live in like Florida. Anyway, putting aside all the spelling and grammar issues, this part is also just as funny. Like, I love that Drew tells his kidnappers that they should just let him go because he needs to profess his love to Danny. I love imagining that Drew says this and the kidnappers just let him go. Drew goes back and tells Danny he loves him, and then the kidnappers just take him back to Costa Rica. I also love this sentence of, "They made out and wiggled around the couch." Like, what the fuck do you mean by wiggling around the couch? It's just so funny to imagine what it looks like to have Danny and Logan wiggling around the couch while trying to make out with each other. Anyways, let's move on. The next part of the story is titled Coming Home. The door slowly opened and Drew limped into the apartment and fell on the floor. "Danny!" he said hoarsely. Danny stopped crying and ran out and gasped, "Drew!" He ran to pick him up and help him stand. Drew grabbed him and hugged him tight, and sudden, his lips started touching his and they kissed. Their tongues meshed and their lips entwined, and they made out right there. When they stopped, they smiled at each other. "Be my boyfriend?" said Danny. "Yes." And they smiled and kissed again. "But I have to tell you, Drew, before you came back, Logan was here, and we made out." "Logan Pale?" he roared. "I'm sorry." Drew started crying and ran down the stairs. Then Jackie looked Drew's way that he was running, and Van came in. Danny was crying and told her what was going on. "You should do something romantic to show your story and that he is your one and only." You're right. He whipped the tears off, and Jackie grabbed a camera and started recording. Danny looked solely to the camera with love in his eyes. Hi, Gregs. Today I finally told Drew I love him like I said I would. But before that, someone else came over and I kissed them. I love you, Drew, and it will never happen again. You are my light and joy, and I would be proud to be your husband, he said softly. Then Jackie whipped a tear from her face and sniffled and turned off the camera. That was amazing. I'm sure he will say yes. It's true love, she said. And that is the end of Coming Home. My first question is, why did the kidnappers just bring Drew back home? Or did Drew manage to escape and the writer just decided not to tell us how Drew escaped his kidnappers? Maybe he watched a Troom Troom video about escaping a kidnapping situation. Again, the misspelling of words leads to a lot of funny shit, like misspelling Logan Paul's last name as it is being questionably exclaimed. I also like the part there near the end where Jackie whipped a tear off of her face instead of wiping it. I also love that Danny has to make a YouTube video where he confesses his entire love for Drew and is never going to love anyone else but Drew because all of Danny's Gregs really needed to know this information, I guess. Also, for some reason, Jackie is just here helping Danny and Drew out as if she was just standing out there waiting for all of this to happen. Let's keep going. The next part of this story is titled The Story So Far. Warning: suicide and sex scene. Keep that in mind. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Drew was at a sushi restaurant when someone sat beside him. Drew Gooden? He said. He looked up. Jake Paul? He almost flinched. Yeah, I heard you and Danny had a rough thing happen. He then posted this, and he pulled out his phone and went to a video and opened it to let him watch. Danny was looking at the camera intense and started talking. Today, I finally told Drew it will never happen again. Never kiss him again. I am with someone else. And then there was a sniffled sound and someone was behind the camera? Danny started to cry silently, but tried to look together. Let me buy you a drink. And Jake ordered sake, an Asian drink. They started drinking and talking and laughing and having a good time. Maybe I was wrong about you, Jake, said Drew. Jake put his arm around him confrontingly. Of course, baby. They both drunkenly left the bar and stumbled to the hotel room Jake was staying in. Jake started kissing him and pushing him to the bed, and they made out there. Then they started doing it. But Drew didn't know about the camera. It was being live streamed. I love you, Jake, cried Drew on stream. Danny and Jackie watched, shocked and dumbfounded as they watched. Jackie looked at Danny, then black at the video. How could he? Danny strolled around the house. Jackie tried to call him down, but Danny opened the window and jumped. Jackie screamed and called 011. And that is the end of the story so far. So if you recall, we were warned that this part of the story has suicide and a sex scene. Now they delivered on the suicide by having Danny jump out the window. They did not, however, deliver on the sex scene because I guess the writer's idea of a sex scene is just saying, then they started doing it. I was promised a sex scene and I didn't get one. Okay. Granted, I wouldn't have read this out on a YouTube video, and I would have said exactly what the writer wrote here, and then they started doing it. Anyway, how do you almost flinch? I really want to see someone almost flinch, because I don't think it's possible to almost flinch. You either flinch, or you don't. Spelling errors make shit funny. We have Jake put his arm around him confrontingly, and right at the end with Jackie screamed and called 011. According to Google, dialing 011 is the first step to calling a phone in another country, not for emergency services. But it's just really damn funny. Plus, also in the end of the video, we have Jackie looked at Danny, then black at the video, and we also have, how could he? Denny stromed around the house. Yes, Denny and stromed. It's just so great, these spelling errors. Now we continue on, though. The next part of the story is titled Believer. Drew woke up with a hangover and threw up. Then he heard his phone ring and he picked it up. It was Jackie yelling "I" to the phone and calling him shit for what he did to Danny. What? Said Drew. He found someone else? He said he found someone else? What? No, he didn't. I'm sending you the video he made for you. Then she hung up and he got the notification for it. He opened it and his lover spoke the words of love right from the heart. He spun around and glared at Jake. You liar! He screamed. Then he threw his phone at Jake and ran out. Meanwhile, in the suicide hospital, Danny was sitting in a chair watching a TV show when a nurse said, "You have a guest." He expected Jackie again with some McDonald's or something, but instead, Drew. He flinched. What do you want, traitor? He hissed at him. Jake lied to me. He made me think you moved on and I slept with him. Are we even? Can we be together? If you can forgive me. I do. Forgive me? Yes. Then they embraced and kissed. Danny pulled away and knelt down and pulled out a box. I was going to do this somewhere better, but will you marry me? Drew cried happy tears and nodded, and they made out again. Let's get you out of here, said Drew, and they left holding hands. And that's the end of Believer. I love that as soon as Drew wakes up, he just throws up right off the bat. Big question from this part is, what the fuck is a suicide hospital? Are there hospitals just for suicidal people? Does that really exist? I'd also like to point out that Danny finally accomplished a full-on flinch here. Why did Danny throw his phone at Jake? Doesn't he need his phone? Why not find something else to throw at Jake, or just leave without throwing something? I love that Danny hissed a sentence at Drew because that's something people do. I love this here sentence. Are we even? Can we be together? Like, I get the second question, but what is the first question about? Previously, Danny was saying that Jake made him think that Drew moved on and that Danny then slept with Jake. And then Drew is just like, are we even? I'd also like to ask that question too. Are we even what? Is he saying, are we even now? Or, I don't really get it. The question just kind of seems pointless. I also get slightly confused with who is saying what in this part because there's very few times that the writer put in any Drew said or Danny said or, any kind of indication as to who was saying what. Moving on. The next part of the story is titled Chain Reaction. Danny got out of bed where his fiancée was sleeping and he went to the bathroom. He then spotted something in the sink that he guessed Drew forgot. He picked it out of the sink and looked. It had 2 lines and was ... a pregnancy test. He busted out of the bathroom. Drew, he said, and Drew sleepily got up and then gawked at what was in his hand. What is this? Are you? He looked down ashamed. I'm going to the doctor tomorrow to check. Please go with me. They can do a test. He gulped. Okay, in the morning. They waited in the office of the doctor's office until they called Drew's name. They went in and the doctor came into the checkup room. They were in. Are you his husband? Asked the doctor. Danny nodded. Well, we have to test his pee, so if you step outside. And he did, and went back in after the doctor came out with a cup of pee to test it. He sat next to Drew and helped his hand. Okay. The doctor came back in and stared at his chart. Well, Mr. Gooden, you are pregnant, and Mr. Gonzalez isn't the father. They both dropped their jaws. To be continued. And that's the end of Chain Reaction. How did Drew get pregnant? Isn't it, like, biologically impossible for a male to get pregnant? I'm sorry, I'm trying to say this, like, in the least sexist way as possible. I guess the story takes place in a universe where anyone can just get pregnant. And this is also ignoring the fact that the person got pregnant with, like, in a day or two, maybe less. It's not really clear in the story. And that a test is that accurate that quickly. Like, all of this just makes no sense at all. But it is still really fucking funny. I love this sentence. They waited in the office of the doctor office. Like, I'm just imagining an office within the office of the actual doctor because it's just really funny. And I also like the part where it said that he helped him with his hand. Like, helped him do what with his hand? Did he, like, jerk him off in the doctor's office? It's just so funny. Anyways, let's move along. The next part of the story is titled White Wedding Part 1. It was a hot July day, and the concert hall was decked in white everywhere. Danny and Drew invited their fans for free to see their wedding, but so many wanted to come that they had to get a concert hall. There was a preacher and a pretty white arch and music playing and food outside. In the room with Drew, he was putting on his white suit and brushing his hair. He got a knock at the door and someone popped in. It was Ethan and Hyla Klein. H3, he said, and they went over to hug him. I'm so excited for you, Hula said. Thanks, Ethan. Will you walk me down the aisle? My dad doesn't accept I'm gay and won't do it. He started to cry a little. Ethan hugged him. Of course, buddy. And he out his arm and he looked it and they walked slowly out. That was a tough sentence. They stood at the start of a red carpet that went to the arch and Drew laughed nervous and Ethan pat his arm and they started walking as the wedding song started playing. The fans went crazy and clapped, and they stopped at the preacher and stood by him and waited. They looked at the entrance and waited for Danny. First, Jackie came out to be the bridesmaid, and Jenna Marbles did too. They looked so pretty. Then, PewDiePie came out with Danny on his arm. They both smiled, and Danny blushed wearing his baby blue tux. Drew started crying because he loved him so much. The music kept playing and Jenna Marbles' dogs were in front of them with little rose petals baskets in their mouths and petals flew everywhere as they ran up the aisle. Danny stood across him and they looked at each other with misty eyes. The press smiled at them both and started talking. Drew Gooden, do you take Danny Gonzalez to be your husband, to hold in love forever as long as you both live? Drew nodded. Yes, I do. And Danny Gonzalez, do you take Drew Gooden to be your husband, to love and cherish for as long as you live? I do, said Danny. All the fans looked so happy and crying, and Jackie and Jenna and Ethan and Hilla and PewDiePie all cried happily too. If anyone thinks these two should not be married, speak now. And the room got quiet, and nobody breathed. Then someone stood up from the crowd and jumped on stage. It was Logan! With 6 exclamation points. Logan Paul? Danny said. Yes, I don't think they should get married. He's carrying my baby, he shouted, and the whole room gasped. Drew started crying and wished he was somewhere else. Jake Paul fans started screaming for Logan and Drew to get married. Then Ethan started going into Logan to push him away from the stage. Then suddenly fights started breaking out with all the fans Andrew and Danny ran away, and the others escorted them. They all got to the limo and drove off fast. Right, and that is the end of White Wedding Part 1. Something funny right off is that Danny and Drew invited the fans for free to see the wedding because, you're supposed to charge people to attend your wedding. Now, I legit feel bad for Danny here having to have the worst person on YouTube, PewDiePie, walk him down the aisle. I got nothing else to say about this part, so let's move on to the last part. The last part of the story is titled White Wedding Part 2. Danny, Drew, come out here. Ethan and Hula and Jenny and Jackie and PewDiePie were outside the cabin they were staying in till everything blew over. Danny looked out the window and gasped. Outside was a big trellis with roses and lots of food on a table, and music started playing. There was balloons, and everyone was dressed up. No way! They went outside. What is this? They both asked, blushing. We felt bad about what happened, so we made you a nice private wedding with just us, said Jackie with a big smile. They all hugged, and Ethan said, I can marry you. I do Jewish weddings, but it can still count for you, he said. Then Danny put out his hand and Drew took it. Shall we? He nodded and took his hand. He led him to the roses, and Ethan stood in between them. Now, Drew Gooden, do you take Danny Gonzalez to be your husband? Will you love and cherish him in sickness and health? I do, he said softly. And Danny Gonzalez, do you take Drew Gooden to be your lovely husband through poor and riches for as long as you both live? I do, Drew said back. Ethan smiled. First, Drew, yes, babe, I want you to know I want to adopt the baby. Drew had happy tears in his eyes, and Ethan said, I now pronouns you man and husband. And they fell into a kiss. The end. And that is the end of White Wedding Part 2 and the entire story. I'm not really sure what a big trellis is here. Tellise. I don't know. Whatever it is, it had roses and food on it. Is it some sort of table? A favorite sentence in this part is everyone was dressed up. I hope that everyone is dressed up. It is a wedding after all. I am a bit confused about the part where Ethan says he can marry Drew and Danny because he's done Jewish weddings, but it can still count for them. I mean, they're not doing a Jewish wedding, right? So you wouldn't marry Drew and Danny as if it was a Jewish wedding. So there would be no doubt that it would still be official. However, the best and funniest part here is this. So Danny puts his hand out and Drew takes it. And then Drew takes his hand again. So I guess Drew took Danny's other hand. So Danny and Drew are standing there holding both hands. And then Ethan is just right smack in the middle of them. Then it gets even better when Drew not only says, I do, to the vows directed at him, but then Drew also says, I do, to the vows directed at Danny. And it ends in even more hilariousness when Drew and Danny fell into a kiss. And that is the end of the story. This story is bad, but it is so funny to read, and I'm glad I took the time to search out and read the story for myself. As a whole, like I said, it's pretty bad. There's a lot of spelling and grammar issues, things that are capitalized and aren't. It's all over the place, as well as things that are just never addressed and left open. The biggest one I can think of is that we know what happened to Drew's quote-unquote girlfriend, according to this story, Amanda. But what happened to Danny's significant other? Has Danny just been single this whole time? Now, something that's funny is that just by searching House of Gold on Wattpad, I have seen that there's more of these. There's House of Gold Remastered, House of Gold Parody, House of Gold 2.0, and House of Gold parentheses My Way. I am honestly tempted to make a video of my own rewrite of this story. I'm not really sure if I will, but if I don't do it, But if I do it, it'll probably not happen for a while. Although I could just read one of those other stories. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So thanks for joining me on this journey through a really bad but hilarious YouTuber fanfic. That's all I have to say, so if you want to add in the conversation, leave a comment below. As always, thanks for listening, and goodbye.